Hello and welcome to Foster Talks for foster kinship and adoption caregivers. Knowing that being a caregiver for a child that's experienced trauma can be both joyous and challenging, our vision is to provide knowledge and support for caregivers through humor, conversation, community, and tools that can be used in real life, learning from one another and from our experts. Today's topic is talking to our kids about gender. All parents know the sex talk, but have you had the gender talk? In this presentation, we discuss some gender basics, language use, and details on how we talk to our kids about gender. We'll dive into making our home a safe place and what to do if your kiddo comes out. Hello and welcome to Foster Talks. I'm Pam and will be your host for the presentation with our guest, Eddy Robinson. Eddy is a community organizer, speaker, educator, and advocate. They are an MRU graduate, Mount Royal University graduate, and are currently the community programs and outreach coordinator at Skipping Stone Foundation. They have been working with the LGBTQ community for over 10 years, including at local organizations such as the Center for Sexuality, the SAMRU, that's the Student Association, Mount Royal University, Pride Center, and Calgary Pride. Eddy is well versed in and passionate about non-binary inclusion, radical body positivity, and accessibility. I love that. Eddy, welcome so much. I'm so excited that you're here.
Me too. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a big piece. You and I had kind of started our conversation ahead of it in regards to, for a lot of our kiddos that are having a care experience or being in care with foster parents or kinship or their caregivers, gender is a big piece of understanding and learning about for our caregivers. And I think today being able to have this conversation will be phenomenal to learn some more.
Yeah, and it's I think a lifelong personal journey, no matter who we are. So let this be maybe your first or 10th step, and I hope that it brings everyone some sort of learning.
Absolutely. Well, and I think a big piece, like for foster parents, for kinship parents, for adoptive parents, for any parent, to be quite honest, if you're providing that care to a child, you're wanting them to feel loved and be able to be their authentic selves and to ensure that they feel safety in your home. For a lot of our foster caregivers and kinship caregivers, that safety or that trauma piece that the children that they're providing care for that have experienced, creating that safety is a huge component. And as we kind of go into this, you had talked about that is a huge part for ensuring kiddos feel that.
Yeah. And I think that there are lots of ways that we can make our kids feel loved and supported. And I think conversation and vulnerability is a really big part of that. But I also think that kids, will feel loved in ways that, however ways we can show it. So even though this presentation has lots of tips and tricks, however people show love is like the most important thing to get to know about ourselves, so that we can, because that's like the core of any work that is about supporting kids, is how do we express and show love to them.
Absolutely. So you have a presentation for us today, Gender 101.
I do, yeah. We're just going to walk a little bit through kind of the basics of gender, so we have a shared basic understanding, and then we can really get into the details of like how parents can support their kids.
Perfect. Absolutely. I love being able to provide some tools, some ideas, and to expand that knowledge so that parents can feel a little more confident in whatever is kind of coming through for them in their caregiver journey. So this looks great.
And any tools that people can find to expand their language and their knowledge, I think are beneficial tools. So at the end of the presentation, there's going to be a slide of resources that, of course, you folks will have that you can pass on to those parents as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So we'll get started. And I think the beginning of any journey is doing some self-analyzing work. And any part of that is taking a look at our own experiences. So doing that, I think everyone can kind of go through their own journey of what their experiences of gender are. And that can kind of help with the beginning steps of breaking it down. So I like to say, like, how can we ask ourselves questions? Questions like, what's a time that I've felt different from other folks of my own gender? And I think that the answer is, like, everybody has some sort of answer for that question. And we can use this as a tool to explore our own gender, which is a really cool thing that we can do with our kids when they're exploring their gender. So don't be afraid to do a little bit of a gender journey yourself with your kids.
Absolutely.
And before we really get into some of the current models of gender, I just want to also acknowledge that the primary system that we are working off of today is very much like a Christian colonial concept. So our model of gender is very much based on that. And this impacts people all around the world. But most importantly, it's that gender is different depending on culture, because gender is a large part of what we understand as culture. So this has significant impacts specifically on Indigenous communities and other racialized communities. And there's, so much more we can learn on this subject, but it's important to know that the trans identities that we know today are based on deconstructing this Christian Eurocentric model that gender diverse people and that gender diverse people have existed all around the world and all through time.
Well, and I think that's really a huge point, because we're looking at colonialism, we're looking at intergenerational trauma with our kids, and often LGBTQ2S+, which is two-spirited from the Indigenous lens, is a huge piece of also comprehending that previous to colonialism, two-spirited was being able to hold both masculine and feminine from a Indigenous lens. And then that became a huge shift to being that it's one or the other. There isn't that both, but again, this is phenomenal to bring up, because it is a Western perspective.
Yes.
And when we're learning from a cultural lens, we have to look at kind of that pre-colonial piece to be able to move forward.
Yeah, and even when we're looking at new models of gender, they're still based on trying to deconstruct the old models.
Yes.
So there's still the influences of that Christian model. So I think it's a really important acknowledgement.
Yeah, you have to go back to go forward, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And so, like, what is this Christian Eurocentric model? It would be what we call the binary. And there was an image in the first slide as well that showed that the binary is kind of our idea that that essentially there are two possible genders that are based on your sex, and this determines things like your expression, your sexuality, your life choices, things like that. And this is what we're trying to deconstruct from here on out. This model is based in what we call like biological determinism or essentialism. And those are like anthropological terms that are based, that try to use science to reason the connection between sex and gender. And I didn't cite research here, but there is tons of research to say that that's a broken model, and it's actually based on like how we perceived it at first, and we've grown past this.
So just trying to learn with you, like learn from you, would be that there's gender and then there's sex, meaning I was born with these physical features, and then there's gender as to this is how I identify. Is that correct? Am I understanding?
So this is the old model that we're working with, the model that we're trying to break down. So we'll get into what breaks up this model, but this is the one that this is the Christian colonial concept of gender being the binary, being it there as men and women. You're born, and the doctor says it's a boy, and from that moment on, there are expectations that are applied to you.
Right. Okay.
And this is the model that we're trying to break down.
Okay.
So the new model, or like one of the new models that we want to offer up, was made by the Trans Student Educational Resources. It's called the Gender Unicorn, and there are a couple problems with it, but there's issues with every model, and there's so many different models out there. So I'm using this as just one example, and this is the one that really separates gender identity, gender expression, sex, and attraction as completely separate things. No. And we see them on multiple spectrums for each thing. So it really serves to show the diversity of the human experience. So we have gender identity as a spectrum, which is separate from sex. So people are assigned a sex at birth, and that can be, there are multiple options for that as well. And then we have, we grow up and we either say, oh yeah, that aligns, or it doesn't align. And we find and go through our own gender journey. And part of that might be going through our gender expression journey, which is finding like pieces of clothing or haircuts or like accessories that make us feel really good and align with our gender identity.
Right.
And we might also go through a sexuality journey, and which is separate from gender. So we're also parsing out that your attraction to someone is based on your sex and gender. Those are also separate things.
So just to kind of clarify with the gender unicorn, the first is gender identity, female, male, girl, male, man, boy, and other genders. It moves to gender expression, feminine, masculine, other. Sex assigned at birth, female, male, other, intersex. Moves to physically attracted to, women, men, and other genders. Moves to, and not moves to, but the next is emotionally attracted to, women, men, and other genders. So this gives us some new language as to understanding that gender identity, gender expression, sex assigned at birth, physical attracted to, and emotionally attracted to can all be part of that conversation and that understanding. So wanting to have a better comprehension of how does this show up for kids that we could be caring for. I love how this has given me a little bit more, like it's not just a big, you kind of start at LGBTQ and you're kind of trying to figure out everything. But for a caregiver, it's sort of like, okay, there's other pieces to that. It starts to give me some other language.
Yeah, and what I really love about this is that it really breaks it up into multiple different spectrums even. So another example of ways that we've tried to break down the binary is by explaining gender on a single line.
Okay.
From
you're using the word spectrum, which we have like in the caregiving. Spectrum is definitely a word that we're familiar to. So to now apply that to gender gives us a little bit more of an understanding that because spectrum is often kind of seen as a combination of different pieces. Would that be how that fits here as well?
Yeah, so the evolution of this resource really started with us explaining gender as a spectrum and not just two completely separate circles,
right,
or categories. We were using gender to explain, we were using a spectrum to explain the diversity of gender, and even that one line didn't seem to capture the real diversity of the LGBTQ community, because even the LGBTQ community is not a singular line. So what I love about this model is that every single one of these, separate pieces, like puzzle pieces that make us who we are, have three separate spectrums. And I know that kind of could be a little hard to grasp. And so one first step might be really thinking of gender instead of these two categories, like the binary, thinking of it as a spectrum. And so sometimes when I'm helping parents or other support systems understand and, bring their own experiences into the conversation, I say, like, I ask them that question that I said at the beginning, like, how have you felt you haven't fit in with your gender before? And if some people are like, well, I'm a girl and I played sports, then I can be like, yeah, that's a gender role expectation of girls, is that they're not, typically, one of the things that they're interested in is not typically sports. So right. If we think about the number of people who actually fit this very stereotypical man and woman model, we actually find that even among cis people, cis is a word that...
I was just going to say, tell us that.
Yeah, cis is a word to describe, it's actually a Latin term that just means same. So trans is a term that means different, and cis means same, and that refers to the congruence between your sex assigned at birth and your gender identity. So those are the same.
So I've heard the term cisgender, so yeah. That would be same, and then transgender would be different.
Yeah.
From assigned.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So if we think about, like we were saying before, the person who fits a stereotypical gender might be at the very end of that spectrum, and then people who don't fit that stereotype start moving down the spectrum. Okay. And when we hit like a middle point, that's when we might call ourselves trans. That's a really oversimplified model, but it's a really good starting place.
Yeah, so it's introducing a concept. It's introducing a visual that allows, again, like you said, this is a launching point to also inform yourself, to create, like to be curious about, okay, I haven't seen the gender unicorn before. I want to understand a little bit more about that, or I want to understand the term cisgender and transgender. So this is a great platform to be curious and to be able to take that. So not that it's oversimplified, I think it offers a really great place of seeing things a little bit different, rather than, like you said, those two rigid circles that are just one and the other and there's nothing in between, to being able to see now a line that offers that spectrum. And again, we're familiar with spectrum, so applying it here is going to be okay, I get this.
Yeah, and another couple examples of models that I've seen in the past, or ways to kind of think about gender that work for some people and don't work for others, would be like the color wheel. Okay. So if we think of traditionally, like, blue is associated with masculinity and pink is associated with femininity, which has some really fun history about it, by the way, but I won't get into that.
Oh, now I'm curious. Eddy, you can.
Okay, fair.
Quickly there.
Actually, during when Hitler was putting people in concentration camps, he started to assign people different symbols for why they were being imprisoned. And he assigned the pink upside down triangle to basically gay or gender diverse people. And that was when pink was associated with femininity. It actually used to be the opposite. Pink was associated with masculinity. But when they started to assign pink triangles to people who were different in their sexuality or gender, it actually swapped. Really? So that's when we started to associate femininity with pink.
That's phenomenal. Like, thank you for, again, that makes me more curious now.
It really goes to
understand. Yeah.
Really goes to show the, like, cultural impacts on gender.
It does. Absolutely. And again, coming back to that cultural aspect that's been, because, that cultural aspect that's been just the go-to has been colonial and Western Europe. So let's go back to the color wheel. Tell me a little bit more about that.
The color wheel is kind of a way to explore a deeper spectrum. So when we think of color as gradients, and we think of genders as being placed on the gradient of all of the colors, it really goes to show, again, the diversity of where people can be in thinking of their gender. So blue and pink being just two colors on our color wheel, but really there's a whole beautiful spectrum of genders, and it can go in any direction, you know.
Absolutely. I love that.
Yeah.
And again, we're going back to the piece and around the gender unicorn, that those are they part on that spectrum as well? Like these are what kind of that gives us a bit of understanding of the spectrum, the gender identity, gender expression, sex assigned at birth, physically attracted to and emotionally attracted to. Just kind of wanting to bring that back in recognizing that these can be part of that conversation that you're having with kiddos, and understanding that it's not just one statement and that's it. It's expanding and kind of understanding with the color wheel that there's a lot of different pieces to that. It's not just, okay, I'm this and therefore it's, let's explore. Tell me a little bit more about that.
So. Yeah, and this is a complicated conversation, a big conversation to have. And if you're not ready for a big conversation, that's okay. Yeah. But I think the core of understanding, or having any of these conversations is coming from a place of non-judgment. Okay. Because I think the core of any of our work is recognizing that other people's experiences are different from ours, and that's okay. And so, again, I think that this can be a tool as a way to understand our own concepts of gender, and then the practical things that will come of that are because we've done our own work.
Right. So, because if you're feeling judgment, if you're feeling discomfort, one of the questions that you'd be asking yourself is, why am I feeling that? Where is that kind of coming from? Like right now we're having this great conversation and I'm kind of feeling like, oh my gosh, I don't want to appear like a dork or say the wrong thing or, not get it. And that would be kind of something that I would feel with a kiddo in saying, I don't want to. But if I'm raising feelings of judgment, I need to ask myself also where those are coming from. Like, is that coming from things that I was taught as my in my own upbringing? Is that shown up in an experience I had in years at a workplace, etc.? Like, you have to kind of go back into doing that. So thank you for that, for kind of saying, you begin the conversation at a place of kind of recognizing your own pieces in it.
Yeah, and I think that fear of messing up is a really big piece that many people experience, and I think any parent can relate to that feeling at any point in time. And I think a lot of those conversations are about, like, it's okay to mess up. I think being vulnerable and saying, I'm sorry I messed up, thank you for teaching me, we'll do better next time. That's showing and role modeling, how to mess up and apologize and move on. You're, no matter what, teaching your children something. So
that's very true. Yeah. Like that rupture and repair. I may not have handled that the best, but can I have a redo? Can I, but in that redo, there also has to be the responsibility to gain knowledge or educate self or understand your own biases or judgments. It can't just be, okay, I'm just going to keep doing it the same. So
yeah, and I think we can have a big gender talk, but if we're still coming from a place of judgment, then kids, as we know, are very keen. They pick up so many things.
Yeah.
So as soon as we take that non-judgment into the world and they see us acting with judgment, all of what we just taught them goes away.
Really true. Yeah. And for a lot of our kids, their radar is high.
Yeah.
Looking for that non-judgment, because for kids that have experienced trauma, there's already been a a break in their security. There's already been a piece where there's been shame, or there's been fear, or there's been pieces. And if that's kind of been familiar through some other experiences of trauma, then when they're going to be really vulnerable and saying, this is who I am, and you're receiving that in a way where we often say, meet them where they're at.
Yeah.
For every child, meet them where they're at. But again, it's that responsibility of being able to explore what that's going to mean.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the next slide is really going to go into some of those practical pieces.
Wonderful.
And that is, how can our non-judgment reciprocate or come out in our language? And I think language is a really important piece that we're often very nervous about. And I think it's fair because it's an important piece. And it's hard to find the words and know the words and teach the words, especially when we have kids that are potentially, still learning and developing their communication and their worldview. Sometimes they're not going to know the words for how they feel, and that's okay. And it's okay to be patient and let them find where they're at. And one element of language is pronouns, which are what you see up here. Pronouns are words that we use to replace names in sentences when we're communicating about people. And on the screen here are just a couple examples of pronouns that we use. So she, her, they, them, or he, him. There are other types of pronouns like you, I, ze, zer. Pronouns are a natural part of our language and have evolved lots over time, and they're still evolving. Especially if you speak another language, you're probably super aware of how different pronouns are depending on the language, which is a super cool tool.
Okay.
And the best, general advice I can give for exploring pronouns or language is to start neutral and let them guide the way in finding what best words fit them. Sometimes we really want to just, give them the language we think they want, and sometimes we can guide them in that way. But a really important piece in our journey is gaining control over the narrative of how we come out or how we find the words for ourselves. So it's a really powerful journey to be able to find the words that feel they fit us best. And it's a really hard balancing act of helping to support our kids in finding the right words and letting them find the right words for themselves. And there's really no right answer.
Right. And I think that pronouns are, I had two things kind of brought to my attention. One is that if somebody consistently called you by your wrong name, like by your name wrongly, at some point you get really frustrated and say, okay, my name is. And if it's intentional, like as being, okay, you've told me this pronoun, but I choose to say this pronoun. The term pronoun showdown, where it's sort of like, if I'm not gonna, like, it's a respect piece. It's no different than if somebody says, I'd like you to call me Mr. or Ms. or she, her, or he, him, or they, them. It's about thinking about, would you want your name consistently mispronounced? Or, it's sort of like, I'm just, you kind of, you look like a Chris, so I'm just going to call you Chris. Like, and it's like, but that's not my name. Like, don't.
Yeah.
So that was a big piece for me, and just kind of understanding that as it's that language is so powerful and acknowledging. So.
Yeah, an example I like to give to folks who, if they've ever been married in the past, is they were given the option of potentially choosing their partner's last name or taking the opportunity to change their name in some way. And if you, run into an old friend and they say, oh, like, hey, how's it going? And they use your whole name and you're like, actually, I got married, so I changed my last name. And they're like, oh, but I'll always know you as this person, so I'm not going to honor And, you know, that's a journey that you went through, and you chose to take your partner's last name. And now someone else is not honoring that because they've known you as this person your whole life.
Oh, that's a great example to understand. That is phenomenal.
Yeah, it's just again, finding ways to find empathy in our own lives and ways to connect our own experiences to other people's experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that.
So the next couple slides are going to get into some more language and more like big scary concepts. And one of those scary concepts that we might know as transition. So your kid has expressed that they have some interest in exploring gender, or they have some discomfort in the gender they were assigned at birth, or you're noticing some signs that maybe this might be a journey they want to go on. It might feel super overwhelming. It's a whole new world, and there's lots of different terms, and you don't know where to start. And that's okay. There's lots of resources, and we're here as that resource today. And I want to start with like the interest or discomfort that's guiding their decisions. And that's what we call dysphoria. And I think it's important to start there, because oftentimes we don't have the word dysphoria in our tool belt, but we have just a way of communicating that we are uncomfortable, or something is not quite right. And that can be in lots of different ways. But the American Psychiatric Association defines gender dysphoria as a conflict between a person's physical or assigned gender and the gender they were of which they identify. So people with gender dysphoria may be very uncomfortable with the gender they were assigned, sometimes describing being uncomfortable with their body, particularly developments during puberty, or being uncomfortable with the expected roles of that assigned gender. So that's the official definition of gender dysphoria. And that can reciprocate in ways like, no, I want to wear a dress, or I want to play with these toys, or actually, I want you to use this word, this name for me. They may not have the word dysphoria, but they may be expressing some discomfort. Conversely, there's also euphoria, which is a word that's not as often used, but it describes the opposite. It's the joy or feeling of excitement that we get because something aligns with how we feel. And transition is the process of going from dysphoria to euphoria. And so I always try to demystify the transition word by just telling people that all that transition is finding a more comfortable and happy way to live. And so it's not necessarily a big, scary thing. And it can start really, really small. So it can start with those pronouns, can start with changing what we wear, or the colors we wear, or our haircut. Or it can be a little bigger. Like we might be super scared of oncoming puberty. We've just gotten the sex talk, we've just gotten puberty talk, and we've gotten told that certain things are going to happen to our body, and we're freaking out. And those are, might seem like big, scary things because they're feeling big, scary feelings. Because that's how our kids are feeling. So I think that, the third part of this diagram is affirmation. And that would be the things that other people do for us, or the things that the relationships in our lives do for us that make us feel affirmed in our gender identity. So there's lots of different elements to this big, scary concept.
I like how it's broken down: gender dysphoria, incongruence which causes distress; transition, actions individuals take to create more of a congruence. Great word. And gender affirming, actions we take to validate, respect, and reinforce a congruence.
Yes.
I think that gives a remarkable understanding. And again, can we see this a bit as on a spectrum as well? Like that gender dysphoria can show up at any age, because I think we often think it is attached to puberty, but we're starting to understand that, or not starting to, but there's more conversations happening in regards that it can be very young.
Yep.
And then that transition is, it can come organically, meaning, like you said, you have a 4 or a 5-year-old that's saying, this is what I prefer. It can become more specific through language of saying, here's where I'm at. And then gender affirming, I mean, we want our kids to feel that they feel validated, respected, and their congruence is one that they feel solid in. Who would, like, all of us want that for our children. So that's really remarkable. And being able, I think that gives, I understand it's a really big topic, but I think that gives a really great place to understand, and introducing some new terms that may not have been in our vocabulary as caregivers.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, it's no matter what, every person's gender journey is going to be different, and not everyone feels dysphoria the same way. So an important part, and an important part about these definitions is that they're quite different for everybody. So transition looks different for everybody, but transition, like we said here, is really just actions that are going to get us to euphoria. So whatever makes us feel discomfort or uncomfortable, or that incongruence, that's the things we want to change to make our life happier. So it's really, very different for everyone. What point of their lifetime they discover that it's the time to make changes. If it is, like, our changes are the actionable items, right? They're the actions we can take. So that doesn't mean that, what we're feeling inside is going to be perfectly aligned with the actions we take. Sometimes our context our environment is going to influence the actions we take. And that's why people might come out later in life and not, not acknowledge their incongruence or gender dysphoria from a really young age. Some people might feel very little gender dysphoria, but the one aspect that they feel is very important to them. So it's so different for everyone. So it's very much a spectrum in who and what people's experiences are. And just to kind of give it a different diagram, here is like some beautiful ways of breaking up the different types of transition. So we mentioned a couple. Someone might want to change their name or pronouns. That's like a social type of change. Some people might feel that the only journey they want to go on is a self journey, and as long as they know their identity, that's what matters. And it might be working through some of our intersecting identities. So how can our gender relate to our neurodiversity? How can our gender relate to race and culture? How can gender relate to our disability? How can gender relate to our age? All of these things are journeys that we might go on personally. Finding the names for our identities, changing our expression might be like an option or a step that people feel like is a really good way to explore, or a good first step. And then, maybe it gets to the point where we want to do some physical changes. And that can look like just finding some gender affirming gear, which are like clothing or pieces of things we can wear to make our body feel like it matches kind of how we
that congruence.
Yeah. So it's not like a super big medical step, because I know some people are afraid of those medical steps. So a good first step to take maybe is finding some gender affirming gear. And then people might decide that hormones or surgery are the right things for them.
Perfect.
And I think the important piece here is, again, that everybody's journey is different. And so there's no point A to point B. There's no one singular path people take, because everybody's dysphoria and identity is different.
So as a caregiver, would it be an option to kind of perceive that this is their journey, and we have the privilege of kind of sitting in the seat next to them, or being at their side, but really it's us as caregivers following their lead. So if a child said, you know what, I'd really like to explore having a binder, which is something they would wear on top, that would be saying, okay, let's figure out where we can find them or what we can connect with that, or even starting to kind of learn ahead of time. So not kind of saying, hey, do you want to go in? I want it, like, because it can go two ways. It can go, I am so on board, we are going to move through this really quickly, or it can be, oh my gosh, this is really overwhelming, I don't even know. But if you take if you take the if the young person, sorry, I shouldn't, I'm just thinking of the kids that we provide care of, but if that kiddo kind of says, okay, this is the pace, we need to respect that pace and educate at every kind of step, as kind of saying, okay, because it's not going to be that it's just a statement and then we're like, okay, we're all, it's good. It's going to be that when you use the word journey, that their journey is one we get the privilege to observe and kind of be in that place. And not always can we be right beside them, but we can also be, like, when you're talking about the exploration, I was just thinking a lot of time we have to give that space for that exploration, and we can't kind of intrude upon that. And I think, again, letting them guide that would be the best thing for a caregiver.
Yeah, I often describe, like, the ways that we can support people in their journeys are to, like, provide some of that, when they come to us, we can be prepared with some resources. Mm-hmm. So if we have a suspicion, or if we've gathered some evidence in our life, and we are taking cues from our kids and realizing that maybe this might be something that they're going through, we can do some research on our own. We can go, okay, if they do want a binder, I know where I can get it.
Okay.
If they do, want to talk to a doctor about something, I know that my doctor's affirming because I've asked them questions.
That's a great thing to talk about, to know.
Things like that, or, if I feel like they're having some internal struggles, maybe if they ask me for help, I'll know a therapist that I can partner them with. Or, I've practiced using gender neutral pronouns on my cat, so I know I can do it if they decide that they want to use a different pronoun. Things like that are ways that we can equip our tool belt for if they come to us, so that we can go, great, I'm ready. That we're ready to support you right now. And I think, that enthusiasm is awesome. And most likely our kids have done a whole lot of thinking about this. They've talked to other people maybe before us, or they've done a lot of time thinking on their own, or they've watched a lot of TV, or they've done their own research. So they've probably thought about this a lot. Mm. So the step that they're at, or the place that they're at in their journey when they come talk to you, is likely way beyond where we think they are, because they've done a lot of internal work. So I say the best way you can be prepared is to try to, like, have a basic understanding. So if it were to happen, you can go, okay, let's get at the same level that you're at. And that's a hard and scary thing. It's hard to want to prepare for everything. We don't want to do, like, doomsday prep for every potential option that our kids could go through. But this is a great start, is to just, like, do some cool reading, or bring cool TV shows into our home that has lots of different representation.
I love that too. That's
things like the small steps, like when we go to a store, don't just automatically assume which section we want to go to. Try all the sections.
Right. Well, and I like you'd mentioned earlier, having your words and your actions matching. So it's sort of like, if you're wanting to ensure that you're not demonstrating that judgment, that's got to be a thread throughout your your world. So if you're going into a store with your kiddo and you're making comments about something that you're observing, that kid is going to pick it up and say, oh wow, well, if I said this, would I get that same thing? So again, it's like you said, doing your own work too, in that, and being able to be congruent in being that person for.
And I think a big part of that journey, and if we're getting a kid who is it's like, especially in the foster care situation, when we're getting a kid who maybe already has come out and already done this journey and they just need you to catch up, that is a hard place to be. It's hard to acknowledge that our kids might know more about something than we do. And so part of our journey, like we've said, being our own, comes with having our own self-care tools, having our own support systems, having our own therapist. So having our own tools to work through the big emotions is a really big part of how we can support our kid. And often with the work that I do at Skipping Stone Foundation is providing parents with some of that resources, because we know that when parents are supported, kids are supported. Because a really big part of going through a gender journey or going through some gender exploration is having a support system. That is like the number one thing that helps to improve mental health. If we've had negative experiences, having adults in our lives that are supportive is the number one thing to prevent negative mental health consequences of exploring or going on a gender journey. So for sure, starting from that place of non-judgment is honestly the key. And I think, our next slide gets into some of this like scary research that might like, I want to provide supportive research, because I know that there are lots of scary statistics out there. And so the not so scary and like really important research out there is that, we've mentioned it a little bit already, that kids really notice, and they really notice things. So our first point on the research page here is that kids start noticing differences between gender at as early an age as 2 years old. And that is, kind of scary. But kids are building their worldview and they're taking in information. And so they start to understand the differences and the cues that the world around us is telling them at really young age. And like I said previously, kids who have supportive adults, both inside and outside their family units, were 4 times more likely to report good or excellent mental health. And just to be clear, trans identities are not a mental health issue themselves. It's the symptoms of our society that causes, so the world telling us that trans identities are not okay, that is what causes mental health issues like anxiety or depression or PTSD. It is
when
not
having that congruence.
Yeah.
Right? Like we're
having that affirmation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the affirmation is a really big piece. And so having a support system and having people who can affirm that the journey we're going on is an okay journey is the number one thing for making sure that people have good mental health. And again, going through like some of our medical transition or the big scary medical changes, which actually aren't that scary, are completely and widely supported by the medical world. I don't want to get into like medical statistics and I'm a bit of a nerd, so I could get into it, but the medical or like the physical changes that we might want to do to affirm or realign or create that congruence with ourselves is medically supported as healthy as it. A lot of parents will come to me and say, like, what if my kid changes, like, what if they change their mind? And what if this is just like a fad? Or what if this is just something they're going through? And not only can I say that the regret rates are like, or like the evidence shows that people do not really change their mind. And if they do, it's based on like social context, and that they might not feel that it's the safest thing for them to do in that moment. But even with that, the worst that can come out of you supporting your kids' gender transition or gender exploration is that they know that no matter what they do, you're gonna love and support them.
Absolutely.
I think that is the most important part of that question, is that, you know, you're not going to cause harm by supporting and loving your kid.
I think that we want to underline that. We really do. Because it's kind of, and I appreciate you bringing that up, because I think that that's often a big piece where it's sort of like, is this a fad? What does this show up like? And again, that's where you do that self-exploration as to, you know, is this so big and scary for you that you just want to minimize it and give it a label and make it temporary? Or is it something that, like you said, you can say, then what can I do to support you in you know, exploring this, understanding this? And I appreciate the research, because foster parents are our 24-hour intervention. So having evidence-based information is a piece that they have come to expect in their own paraprofessional role. So we're looking at this research and being able to say, you know, like you mentioned, transition or a child that is transgender, it's not the transgender piece. Any mental health concerns come in how that's being translated. So that anxiety, that depression, you know, you had mentioned PTSD, and with a kid that's experienced trauma, that could already be present, and then this starts to become more complex or layered. So we're wanting to ensure that we're that adult, because one person makes a difference for a child in how, like you said, they can then say this experience was positive and healthy. So I really appreciate you bringing up because I think we often want to make it, this is just a phase, but we're doing that because it makes us more comfortable.
Yes.
Not because it's true.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and although, you know, the research is out there and we're getting more and more research, I think the thing to really honor is that whatever the research says, our kid is telling us something. And we want to respect their autonomy and their choice and their control, and give them, especially with people who've experienced trauma. A big part of trauma is gaslighting, is the form of being told that what we believe is not the reality. And part of healing from that is trusting our own feelings. And it's really hard sometimes for kids who've experienced trauma to trust that what they're feeling is a reality. And I like to tell people, you know, like that image of this is not a pipe or this is a pipe, that like it's a philosophical conversation about if something is, we create reality. So I'm getting a little philosophical, but
but I appreciate that, because it's again goes back to that congruence.
Yeah. Again, it's a reality that someone is feeling uncomfortable, and we want to get them to a place where they're feeling comfortable, whatever that means.
Yeah, in their definition. I think I would want to again, not as the caregiver's definition as to what that comfort looks like. It's specifically to what that young person has identified as being what is going to be congruent for them.
Yeah, thank you for adding that. And I have included some more research here. So we'll give that back to you, but there's lots of really good books. Especially I used the Families in Transition, the third one down, a resource guide for families of trans youth. It's just such a good self-journey booklet. It's a booklet that step-by-step says, like, let's go through this and let's like break down some of the scary thoughts you're having and really give you the facts.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be able to provide these. Families in Transition, a resource guide for families of transgender youth, supportive families, healthy children, understanding the basics, the gender spectrum. So these are resources we will ensure that are available. on our website as well. So thank you for these.
Yeah. And, at the, just to kind of provide a lasting or like a pulled together aspect, is all of these types of transition that people can go through are things that Skipping Stone Foundation can help with.
Skipping Stones is really quite innovative in how it has, because let's actually connect with that, because our hope is to be able to offer this information not just to the local community but to across. And Skipping Stones is one that people will be able to access regardless if you live in the community or if you're somewhere outside of, like, across Canada. And I think what I have to say is what I've learned about Skipping Stones is it's incredibly innovative. It is truly organic, meaning the people that you will meet and interact with are those that understand the journey. There's different perspectives. There's also a real patience and gentleness in understanding that gaining this information, like you've used the word scary and you've used the word, like, am I going to screw this up? And for caregivers, this is an organization that will receive you the same way you would want your child received. So I just wanted to add that, because often we kind of think that, am I going to ask them questions? My feelings are hurt because my child's telling everybody else but not me, or I don't know how to respond to this, or this is completely clashing, which I learned from my parents as being, again, from a faith perspective or from a social perspective. So I'd like to just kind of say that Skipping Stones has the ability to receive caregivers, parents, in the way that you would want to or hope to be.
Yeah, I think oftentimes people think resources are, not to make a pun of it, but a binary in regards to, are they going to be supportive for parents or for kids in these situations?
Yeah.
And we don't want we don't want to separate families or cause more, turmoil or within the family unit. We want to be able to support everybody. Because, like I said, we know that supporting parents supports youth. And I think a really beautiful part of our organization is that we were founded by a mother and a trans person themselves who are, they were set out to support trans youth and their families. And the goal was to support trans youth and their families. And we've just grown into the needs of the community, and we still continue to grow into the needs of the community. Yeah. So we are always available for questions. We're officially all across Alberta. We know services all across Alberta, but we can of course answer questions from people all over Canada, and have done that. But we know the resource is mostly based in Alberta, and although we only have an office in Calgary, we do have connections all over. So for sure, please do ask your questions. If we're worried about booking an intake or intimidated, a comforting note might be that I do the intakes. So you've already met me.
You've got a familiar face. And I think, like you said, the phenomenal thing is it's supporting families. There's also the option that it's going to support the children that you so want to have an amazing experience and be held in safety and respect and acceptance. And for parents, it's being able to also, or caregivers, it's being able to also kind of say, I need help in this, to understand, to educate myself, but also, is it normal for me to feel like this? So it's a great place that allows both, like, the health and well-being of everyone that's on this journey. So I'm so, thank you so much, Eddy, for sharing your time and support for Foster Talks and our amazing community of foster, kinship, and adoption caregivers. Remember that you can access Eddy's contact information. We're going to have all of the resources. Their website will have to book an intake, emailing for questions. And we appreciate, Eddy, that you've kind of said, here's, I'm already a familiar face. Here's a really great place to begin. And then we will connect everything again on our social media, Facebook and Instagram, to our website. But thank you so much for letting us kind of begin here, or to gain our own knowledge, and some of the work that we can do in our own journeys as caregivers. So I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me and for the opportunity. I'm really excited about the connections we'll make.